Sirens shattered the silence of the night as police officers arrived at Crystal Perry's home. The moment they stepped inside, they were confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. Blood covered nearly every surface. The floor, the countertops, the walls, turning the entire kitchen into a canvas of crimson. Even the most experienced medical professionals could see at a glance that she had stood no chance. No matter how quickly paramedics might have arrived, the sheer extent of blood loss had made survival impossible. This wasn't just a murder, it was a frenzied, merciless attack. Her torso, arms, and neck were marred with stab wounds, each one a testament to the sheer violence of the crime. By the time the final count was made, the number was staggering, over 50 knife wounds. In this documentary film, we will examine real photos and investigate the case related to Crystal Perry, who was born on August 23, 1963, in the quiet, working-class town of Rumford, Maine. Crystal was the youngest of 10 children, born into a family that struggled to make ends meet. Her parents worked tirelessly, stretching every penny to feed and clothe their large brood. With so many mouths to feed, individual attention was a luxury, and discipline was strict but necessary. Her eldest sister, 12 years her senior, took on the role of a second mother, tending to the younger ones with the patience and care of someone far beyond her years. She made sure they were fed, helped them with schoolwork, and did her best to provide comfort in a house where exhaustion often took precedence over affection. Despite the love between siblings, growing up in a home packed with 10 children bred a yearning for independence in each of them. As they grew older, one by one, they left, scattering across different cities and states in search of their own futures. Crystal, too, longed for a life of her own, one where she could finally feel like she belonged to herself. In high school, she met Tom, a boy who, at the time, seemed like her escape. They fell into an easy romance, one filled with young love's typical dreams of forever. Not long after graduating, they married and moved to California, seeking the allure of a fresh start and the promises of a bigger life. After a year and a half, she and Tom made the decision to return home, seeking comfort in the familiar quiet of Maine. They settled in a small town called Bridgeton, an idyllic place often blanketed in the eerie mist that had inspired Stephen King's famous novel. Crystal found work at a local shoe store, and Tom picked up various odd jobs, doing what he could to contribute. Life in Bridgeton was modest, but for a time, it was good. Crystal soon discovered she was pregnant, and with that news came a renewed sense of purpose. In the months that followed, she imagined a future where she could give her child everything she had once longed for. When their daughter Sarah was born, Crystal felt an overwhelming sense of joy. She finally had something that was truly her own. However, the happiness was short-lived. While Tom had initially been enthusiastic about becoming a father, the reality of responsibility weighed on him. His once affectionate nature began to change, and he spent more and more time at the local bar, drowning his frustrations in alcohol. It wasn't long before his drinking turned into something darker. The money they earned was barely enough to support their family, yet Tom squandered it on booze, leaving Crystal to scrape together whatever she could for food and bills. There were nights when there was no money at all, when she would go to bed hungry, making sure Sarah had enough to eat. The final straw came when Tom stole the money she had set aside for groceries, leaving her in tears, forced to ask for help just to get by. With each passing day, the man she had married became a stranger, and Crystal knew she couldn't raise her daughter in such instability. With quiet resolve, she filed for divorce. Though Tom continued to see Sarah from time to time, his presence in her life was sporadic at best. But Crystal's troubles didn't end with the divorce. Tom's new girlfriend became fixated on her, seemingly unable to accept that Crystal had once been part of his life. The harassment began with angry phone calls, words laced with venom and jealousy. Then came the unannounced visits, showing up at Crystal's house, causing scenes, shouting accusations. It escalated into threats, ones that Crystal couldn't ignore. She feared not just for herself, but for Sarah. She worried about what might happen if Sarah spent time at her father's place. What if this woman's jealousy turned to violence? The thought alone kept her awake at night. Determined to give Sarah a better life, Crystal worked hard, saving every extra penny she could. Eventually, she was able to buy a small house on the outskirts of Bridgeton, a modest but beautiful home nestled near a picturesque lake, surrounded by a thick forest. It was peaceful, almost like a dream come true. This house was hers, something she had earned, something no one could take from her. For Crystal, who had grown up in a crowded home with little space of her own, the solitude was a gift. For Sarah, it was a place where she could feel safe, loved, and cherished. May 10, 1994, was a night like any other. Crystal and Sarah watched a solar eclipse together, marveling at the way the sky darkened in the middle of the day. They laughed, made wishes, and then returned home, enjoying a quiet evening together. The next day followed its usual rhythm. Crystal went to work, Sarah attended school, and they later shared dinner, just like they always did. When it was time for bed, Crystal tucked Sarah in, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Good night, sweetheart." It was a moment Sarah would never forget. In the dead of night, Sarah was jolted awake by a piercing scream. At first, in her sleepy haze, she thought her mother was arguing with someone on the phone. But as her mind cleared, she realized the screams were raw, desperate, filled with terror. Her heart pounded as she crept toward the slightly open door of her bedroom. The sounds were coming from the kitchen. Though she couldn't see anything from where she stood, the sheer horror in her mother's voice sent chills through her. Then, the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. A cold wave of fear washed over her. Someone was in the house. Someone was hurting her mother. Frozen, Sarah barely breathed, terrified that any movement would bring the intruder toward her. She hid behind the bed, waiting for her door to swing open at any moment. But instead, she heard the kitchen drawer open, followed by a sound like someone was rummaging through the silverware. The horrific silence that followed was even more terrifying than the screams. Despite being just 12 years old, Sarah understood with chilling clarity that an unknown intruder had murdered her mother. She wanted to rush to her mother's side, to somehow stop the murder, but sheer terror gripped her body, rendering her unable to move. Her mind screamed at her to act, to do something, but her instincts warned her that confronting the knife-wielding assailant would only lead to her own death. Minutes passed in complete stillness. Sarah remained frozen, listening intently for any sound that might indicate the intruder's next move. Would they come for her? Would they search the house for other victims? But nothing came. The house was eerily silent. The absence of movement sent a shiver down her spine, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled her chest. Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, Sarah finally mustered the strength to move. Step by step, she left the relative safety of her bedroom and cautiously made her way toward the kitchen. The lights were off, the only illumination coming from the moonlight streaming through the window. As she stepped forward, her eyes instinctively flicked to the clock on the wall. It read exactly 1 a.m. Then she saw her mother. Crystal's lifeless body lay sprawled across the kitchen floor in a massive pool of red blood. The sheer amount was staggering, almost surreal, and for a moment, Sarah felt like she might pass out. She wanted to believe this was a nightmare, that she would wake up any moment, safe and warm in her bed. She had to get help. Her trembling gaze landed on the telephone receiver, lying just inches from her mother's outstretched fingers. She lunged for it, barely able to breathe as she pressed the numbers for 911. But as she held the phone to her ear, there was only silence. No dial tone, no operator. Desperate, she ran to her mother's bedroom, where the second phone was. She snatched it up and dialed again, but the result was the same. Sarah realized she had only one option left. She needed to find help in person. Without wasting another second, she bolted out of the house into the cold night air. Dressed only in her thin pajamas and barefoot against the damp ground, she sprinted down the road. She pounded on the first door she reached, but no one answered. Frantic, she moved to the next house, then another. Still no response. The town felt like a ghostly void. Then finally, a glimmer of hope. She spotted an Italian restaurant in the distance, its windows still faintly illuminated. The owners lived in the attached building, With what little energy she had left, she ran to their door and knocked frantically. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing the stunned and concerned faces of the restaurant owners. Sarah barely managed to get the words out. Someone had attacked her mother. The weight of her terror and exhaustion made her legs buckle, but the couple caught her, pulling her inside. They wasted no time in calling 911 themselves. Within minutes, sirens pierced the quiet night as police officers arrived at Crystal's home. The moment they stepped inside, they were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Blood covered nearly every surface: the floor, the counters, the walls. It was as if the entire kitchen had been painted in crimson. Crystal was long gone, and even the most seasoned medical professionals could tell at a glance that she had stood no chance. Even if paramedics had arrived within minutes, the sheer amount of blood loss had made survival impossible. Investigators immediately began combing through the crime scene. A palm print was found on the front door's glass, but initial analysis suggested it belonged to Sarah. Oddly, there were no other fingerprints anywhere. No evidence of the killer's identity left behind. However, a discovery in the kitchen sent a chill through the officers. A series of shoe prints, clearly imprinted in blood, trailed across the floor. They were of varying sizes and angles, indicating movement, hesitation. They led toward Sarah's bedroom, only to stop short and turn back. For some reason, the murderer had decided against entering. An even stranger detail emerged as detectives surveyed the scene further. It appeared that the killer had made a futile attempt to clean up some of the blood. But with the entire kitchen soaked in it, their efforts were largely ineffective. The most puzzling clue was the blood spatter pattern itself. Most of the droplets had landed at an angle, as though flung from a weapon, likely the knife used to kill Crystal. But some drops had a different trajectory. They had fallen straight down, perfectly vertical from a greater height. The implications were chilling. Investigators theorized that the killer had been injured during the attack. The presence of these drops leading to an empty roll of paper towels suggested that the perpetrator had attempted to stop their own bleeding before fleeing the scene. The crime scene medical experts conducted a meticulous examination of Crystal's body, uncovering a staggering and brutal reality. Over 50 stab wounds covered her torso, arms, and neck. The sheer number of wounds indicated excessive rage, a crime of passion or an act committed by someone deeply unhinged. Despite their exhaustive search, detectives were unable to locate the murder weapon at the crime scene. This immediately led them to believe that the perpetrator had taken the knife with them, either as a twisted keepsake or to dispose of it elsewhere. Experts, based on the nature of the wounds and the broken fragment, concluded that the weapon had been a standard kitchen knife, likely one from Crystal's own home. While combing through the evidence, forensic specialists made a crucial discovery: samples of the perpetrator's DNA found on the body, alongside the scattered blood droplets that did not belong to Crystal. These samples were immediately sent to the lab for DNA analysis, but there was a significant setback. Due to budget constraints and severe backlog, the local forensic laboratory was overwhelmed with cases, meaning the test results wouldn't be available for at least 6 months. This delay forced the detectives to launch their investigation without the benefit of forensic confirmation, relying instead on intuition, circumstantial evidence, and methodical detective work. The first avenue of investigation was to rule out robbery. However, a quick assessment revealed that nothing was missing from the house. Valuables remained untouched, and the home showed no signs of forced entry. This led detectives to believe that Crystal had willingly opened the door for her killer. Considering that she was in her pajamas, it was unlikely that she had been expecting visitors at such a late hour. Investigators theorized that the murderer was either someone Crystal knew personally or a stranger who had managed to deceive her into letting them in under false pretenses. With no immediate suspect in mind, detectives turned their attention to the only witness, Sarah. The traumatized 12-year-old had been taken to the hospital for evaluation, and it was there that investigators questioned her. They first asked why she had chosen to run to the neighbors rather than call 911 from inside the house. Sarah explained that both household phones weren't working, an answer that raised suspicion among the officers. Upon inspecting the crime scene, detectives tested both phones and found them in working condition, making successful calls without issue. The questioning then shifted focus to the crime itself. Did Sarah see the killer? She maintained that she had not left her bedroom until it was all over. However, the investigators remained skeptical. How, then, had she immediately concluded that her mother had been attacked with a knife? Sarah insisted that it had simply been obvious from the sounds she had heard, but detectives weren't convinced. They suspected she might be withholding vital information out of fear or trauma. Over the next 3 days, Sarah was subjected to relentless interrogation, questioned a total of 18 times in the hopes that her story would change, or that she would reveal some overlooked detail. Yet, her account remained unchanged. Frustrated but determined, investigators shifted their attention to other leads. A breakthrough came when detectives discovered a pair of boots at a local shoe store, their distinctive sole pattern matching the bloody footprints found in Crystal's kitchen. This clue ignited new avenues of inquiry, but the question remained: who owned the boots? At the same time, police uncovered another lead. Crystal had been the target of persistent harassment from Teresa, the girlfriend of her ex-husband Tom. Teresa had made multiple threats against Crystal, openly expressing her hostility. Despite the killer being evidently male, detectives still pursued this lead, suspecting that Teresa may have enlisted someone to carry out the crime on her behalf. Yet, after exhaustive interviews and surveillance, they found no direct evidence linking Teresa to the murder. Shifting their focus once again, investigators turned their attention to Crystal's recent romantic relationship. At the time of her death, she had been involved with a man named Dennis, whom she had met 2 years prior when he started working at the shoe store. Their relationship had progressed quickly, leading to Dennis proposing marriage. Crystal had accepted, but for reasons unknown, the wedding never took place. It soon became evident that their relationship had been tumultuous. Friends and colleagues reported that Crystal and Dennis frequently argued, and his temper was unpredictable. He had a history of breaking things in fits of rage, punching walls, slamming doors. But there were no reports of him ever physically harming Crystal. Still, his explosive temperament made him a person of interest. The day after Crystal's murder, detectives visited Dennis at his home. When he opened the door, they wasted no time with pleasantries. They asked him outright if he had left his house the night before and whether he had seen Crystal. His reaction was immediate and unsettling. Rather than responding, Dennis's face drained of color, and before he could utter a word, he collapsed onto the floor in apparent shock. Once he regained consciousness, he agreed to answer their questions. In a shaky voice, he admitted that he had indeed planned to visit Crystal that evening. However, he claimed that he had gotten delayed after work while helping a friend fix a car. Upon returning home that night, Dennis called Crystal, hoping to see her, but she told him it was too late. This seemingly small exchange quickly turned into an argument. Dennis, frustrated, stayed home, brooding over their ongoing tensions. He later admitted to the police that their fights had been escalating lately, but he maintained that he would never hurt her. The police were unable to completely verify Dennis's alibi, but they did confirm that he had, in fact, spent the evening helping his friend repair a car. Still, detectives remained skeptical. Dennis agreed to take a polygraph test, and for the most part, the results indicated truthfulness. However, one response stood out. When asked if he felt responsible for Crystal's death, Dennis firmly answered no, but the examiner detected signs of stress. This anomaly, combined with his proximity to the victim, only deepened investigators' suspicions. Adding to the intrigue, detectives noted that Dennis's shoe size matched that of the footprints found at the crime scene, though they found no corresponding footwear in his home. When asked to provide a DNA sample, he readily complied but made an unusual request. He asked detectives for a personal favor. If they ever decided to arrest him, they should come to his workplace through the back door rather than making a scene. He explained that he respected his employer and didn't want to disrupt the business. Considering he adamantly maintained his innocence, this request struck detectives as odd and preemptive. As they continued to dig, investigators discovered something alarming. They contacted Crystal's best friend, who lived in another town, and learned that Crystal had confided in her just weeks before the murder. Crystal had expressed growing fear of Dennis, telling her friend that their arguments were becoming increasingly heated and his temper was worsening. She had even considered ending the relationship, but worried about how he would react. The police then turned to Crystal's colleagues, hoping for additional insight. One coworker didn't provide any immediately useful information during her interview, but something suspicious happened afterward. Shortly after the detectives left, Dennis showed up at her workplace and began pressing her for details about what she had told the police. This behavior further fueled suspicions. Yet without concrete evidence, detectives could do little but continue their search. As weeks passed, another unexpected lead surfaced. A man named Donnie, known for his heavy drinking and tendency to fabricate stories, had been overheard at a party boasting about killing Crystal. Witnesses reported that he was heavily intoxicated when he made the statement. When police brought him in for questioning, Donnie claimed to have no memory of the party or the alleged confession and vehemently denied any involvement in the murder. His reputation as an unreliable source made it difficult to determine whether his claims were true or merely drunken bravado. Ultimately, investigators had to let him go due to a lack of evidence. Meanwhile, another tip came in about a black pickup truck with New Hampshire plates that had been seen near Crystal's home on the night of the murder. The police chased this lead, but it led nowhere. No one could definitively link the vehicle to the crime. In yet another bizarre twist, a woman reported that on the night of the murder, she had been driving past Crystal's house when she heard sirens. Believing they were headed for her boyfriend, who had a history of legal troubles, she kept an eye on the road. That's when she noticed a car tailing her aggressively with its high beams on. Feeling chased, she took a sudden turn onto another road, but the car sped past instead of following her. Although the police considered the possibility that this car could have been linked to the crime, they were never able to verify a connection. With no solid leads, Crystal's family decided to take matters into their own hands. Pooling their resources, they raised $10,000 as a reward for any information leading to an arrest. Flyers were distributed all over town, pleading for witnesses to come forward. But soon, an unsettling development arose. Teresa, the girlfriend of Crystal's ex-husband Tom, was seen tearing down the flyers multiple times. Given Teresa's past animosity toward Crystal, detectives briefly revisited the possibility that she was involved. However, Tom was also thoroughly investigated, and his deteriorating alcoholism cast doubt on his ability to commit such a calculated crime. Additionally, there was no clear motive linking him to the crime. Police also investigated 2 other men Crystal had dated after her divorce, but neither yielded any substantial leads. To ensure they left no stone unturned, all potential suspects, including Tom, voluntarily submitted DNA samples. The department anxiously awaited the forensic results, hoping for a breakthrough. 9 months after Crystal's murder, investigators finally received the much-anticipated DNA results. But the findings left them with more questions than answers. The blood and semen samples collected from the crime scene did not match any of the primary suspects. Not Dennis, not Tom, not Donnie, and not any of Crystal's former partners. The results only deepened the mystery, eliminating every suspect they had considered viable. Detectives, still harboring suspicions about Dennis, requested another DNA sample from him for additional testing. Yet once again, the results were conclusive. He was not the perpetrator. Staring at a dead end, the police were left with only one potential source of new information: Sarah. They still assumed that either she was lying to them or her mind had blocked out the horrific memories of her mother's murder, and she actually saw the killer. At that time, Sarah was living with her aunt in Texas, far from the small town where her mother had been brutally murdered. The police, determined to find any lingering details that might help them crack the case, traveled across the country to speak with her in person. Upon arriving, they subjected Sarah to a polygraph test, hoping it would reveal inconsistencies in her previous statements. However, the results showed no signs of deception. Still, investigators weren't entirely convinced. They continued questioning her day after day, relentlessly pressing her for any small detail she might have missed. Every time, Sarah maintained her stance. She had not seen the killer. Frustrated but left with no choice, the detectives eventually had to accept her response and move forward. With no new breakthroughs, the case went cold, remaining unsolved for years. Despite the lack of progress, law enforcement never stopped searching for Crystal's murderer. They interviewed countless people, reevaluated old suspects, and followed every lead, no matter how insignificant it seemed. But every effort led to a dead end. Hope dwindled, and Crystal's family, especially Sarah, was left with no closure. Then, in the late 1990s, a significant technological advancement changed the course of criminal investigations. The FBI's DNA database became operational. Detectives immediately uploaded the DNA sample collected from Crystal's crime scene, eagerly awaiting a match. Yet, to their disappointment, no results came back. Years passed, and with each passing day, the case grew colder. In 1999, however, a fresh perspective emerged when a new detective was assigned to the case. Determined to uncover the truth, he took a more aggressive approach. He not only reviewed every piece of existing evidence, but also devised a new plan. He would collect as many DNA samples as possible from men living in the town and nearby areas. By that time, forensic technology had advanced significantly, making it possible to process tests much faster. The police gathered hundreds of samples, methodically eliminating suspects one by one. But despite their best efforts, none of them matched the DNA found at the crime scene. Refusing to give up, the detective reached out to Sarah and encouraged her to work with a psychologist specializing in memory retrieval. The hope was that suppressed memories, buried by trauma, might resurface. Sarah agreed to undergo the process. After multiple sessions, the psychologist concluded that Sarah was telling the truth. She had genuinely blocked out the memory and could not recall any additional details about the killer. Once again, the investigation reached a dead end. For years, the case remained dormant, with detectives occasionally revisiting it but finding no new leads. Then, in 2006, an unexpected breakthrough occurred. Investigators received an alert from the FBI database. Finally, after more than a decade, a DNA match had been found. The profile belonged to a man named Michael Hutchinson, someone who had never even been considered a suspect. Detectives quickly dug into his background. They discovered that in 2003, Michael had been arrested for assault and for making threats with a weapon. He had served 6 months in prison and was placed on 3 years of probation. As part of his arrest, a DNA sample was taken, but due to an administrative failure, it was never uploaded to the national database. It had sat in a forensic lab for years, unnoticed and unprocessed. Then, 3 years later, in 2006, Michael was arrested again, this time for driving under the influence with his children in the car. He was released on bail but failed to appear in court, leading to an immediate warrant for his arrest. Police eventually caught up with him, at his own wedding. As per standard procedure, he was placed in custody, and another DNA sample was collected. This time, the sample was uploaded promptly, and within days, it was matched to the DNA found at Crystal's crime scene. The lead detective on Crystal's case immediately contacted Sarah, informing her of the discovery. However, he urged her to keep the information confidential until the authorities were ready to move forward with formal charges. He then asked a critical question. Did she know Michael Hutchinson? Sarah thought carefully, but ultimately answered no. She had never heard of him. With Michael already incarcerated, the detective methodically built the case against him, ensuring that the evidence was airtight. He learned that at the time of Crystal's murder, Michael had been living in Bridgeton, just 2 miles away from her home. At 19 years old, he had been a frequent presence in the area, regularly passing by Crystal's house on his way to visit his mother. His daily routine placed him near the scene of the crime multiple times, making it plausible that he had noticed Crystal and developed an unhealthy fixation on her. When the detective visited Michael in prison to confront him about the murder, the suspect remained defiant. He flatly denied any involvement, claiming that he had never met Crystal in his life. But the forensic evidence was damning. His semen had been found on Crystal's body, and his blood had been discovered at the crime scene. When asked how he could explain this, Michael had no response. During the interview, the detective made another key observation. Michael had a large scar on his palm. This seemingly minor detail was significant because investigators had long believed that Crystal's killer had injured himself during the attack. While the scar itself wasn't irrefutable proof, it further strengthened the case against him. Eventually, with overwhelming DNA evidence, Michael was formally charged with Crystal's murder. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of what had likely happened that night. The night of the attack, he decided to strike, breaking into her home with intent. While he refused to confess and the exact details of the crime remained unknown, the evidence was indisputable. Michael had assaulted and brutally murdered Crystal. During the trial, a long-standing mystery was finally explained: how Michael had managed to avoid leaving a single fingerprint at the crime scene. The answer was unexpected, yet logical. Michael had spent years working as a bricklayer, and due to the nature of the work, the ridges on his fingertips had gradually worn down. This meant that even if he had touched multiple surfaces at the scene, he physically could not leave distinct fingerprints. This revelation, though fascinating, did little to help his defense. Instead, it only strengthened the prosecution's argument that he had committed the crime with the knowledge that he wouldn't leave behind any incriminating prints. In an attempt to save himself, Michael provided his own version of events, spinning a tale that defied logic. He claimed that on the night of the murder, he met Crystal at a local bar. According to him, they had drinks together and later went back to her home. At some point, he alleged, a masked man dressed in a black motorcycle jacket barged into the house. This mysterious assailant, he claimed, knocked him unconscious and proceeded to murder Crystal. When Michael regained consciousness, he insisted that he attempted to fight off the attacker but was wounded in the hand before the man fled. Instead of calling for help or alerting authorities, Michael admitted that he also left the crime scene without any reasonable explanation. His story was riddled with inconsistencies, and the prosecution quickly tore it apart. Firstly, the only shoe prints found at the crime scene belonged to Michael. If another man had entered the house, it would mean that he had done so barefoot, an absurd and highly unlikely notion. Secondly, despite Michael's claims, there wasn't a single witness who could corroborate his story. No one at the bar remembered seeing him with Crystal that night, casting further doubt on his account. The trial reached its conclusion on April 9, 2007. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning a unanimous verdict. Michael Hutchinson was found guilty on all charges. The judge handed down the harshest possible sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole.